All right, here we are in beautiful Nebraska. I think you're going to be very interested and even fascinated with our visit here at the Ashfall fossil beds. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Rick Otto, who is superintendent of the Ashfall fossil beds here in the state park. And Rick, thanks for having us, and we're looking forward to seeing your park, and we thank you for allowing us.
Okay, thank you for coming out, Pastor Mike.
Yes.
Okay. Welcome to the Ashfall Fossil Bed State Historical Park. The Ashfall Park was developed on a fossil site, a fossil site which has the complete skeletons of prehistoric animals that lived here in Nebraska many years ago. We have the many complete skeletons here on this hillside because these animals were all killed at one time by a catastrophic occurrence. This occurrence was a volcanic ash storm which slowly suffocated these animals and buried these animals in pure volcanic ash. Not only do we have the complete fossil skeletons of these animals here at the Ashfall Park, but the volcanic ash has preserved many little details associated with this environment. So this fossil site has produced for us a very complete picture of an ancient environment that was a part of Nebraska at one time. The mural you're looking at here is an artist rendition of what the different prehistoric animals looked like that lived here in Nebraska at the time the ashfall occurred. And when you look across the mural here, you can see that many of the animals look very much like some of the large wildlife that still lives in Africa today. At one time here in Nebraska, we had elephants living in this area, rhinoceroses, many different types of horses, camels, and even crowned cranes. Because we have the complete skeletons of all these animals preserved here at the Ashfall fossil beds, we can paint a picture like this and give you a pretty detailed snapshot of what prehistoric life was like here in Nebraska at one time. Now, here at the Ashfall Park, we find 5 different species of horses, 5 different species of prehistoric horses. And one of these species of horses looks something like this animal right over in this corner here. This little horse didn't get to be much bigger than a collie-sized dog, even as a full-grown adult. One of the larger species of horses we find here looks something like this horse right here. This horse was about the size of a large mule deer. This horse had long, slender leg bones like a deer, and it probably could run very fast like a deer does as well. We find 3 different species of camels as fossil skeletons here at the Ashfall Park. 2 of the species of camels are very similar to the llamas or vicunas that live in South America, as you see depicted right here. One of the species of camels was quite an exotic animal. This species of camel had a long neck like a giraffe, long hefty leg bones like a giraffe. It probably lived its lifestyle very much like the giraffes do that live in Africa today. It probably browsed on the tree leaves like giraffes do. But we can tell that this animal was a member of the camel family. It has camel teeth and camel foot bones, so we do know that this was a member of the camel family. We have found 29 complete skeletons of this type of a bird at the Ashfall Park, and this bird is a crowned crane. The paleontologist who has studied these fossil skeletons tells us that this is a crowned crane because the breastbone of this animal has characteristics of the crowned crane that is still found in Africa today. This particular species of crowned crane was not known to science before these specimens were found here at the Ashfall fossil beds. Over the last 20 years, we have found over 200 complete skeletons of these different animals that we've been looking at here. And most of those 200 skeletons belong to this type of an animal right here, the rhinoceros. The type of rhinoceros we find here at the Ashfall Park was a short-legged rhinoceros with a big barrel chest. And the paleontologists who study these rhinoceroses feel that this type of rhino probably had a lifestyle very similar to the hippopotamuses that still live in Africa today. They probably spent most of their time in the ponds and streams in the area and ate the aquatic vegetation that lived along the ponds and streams. Now, many times when we find the skeleton of one of the full-grown mother rhinoceroses, we'll find the skeleton of a baby rhinoceros laying right next to it. And the skeleton that you're looking at right here is the skeleton of a very young rhino calf that laid down and died right next to its mother. Since we have so many complete skeletons of a particular species of animal, we're able to do a population analysis of some of these prehistoric animals. And that is quite an unusual accomplishment to undertake at a fossil site, but we're able to do that here at Ashfall. Now, it's felt that Nebraska was quite a warm subtropical climate at the time all these animals were living here. And the best piece of evidence we have to think that is the fact that we find fossil tortoises here at the Ashfall Park. And a tortoise is a kind of a land turtle that can only survive in a climate where the temperature does not freeze. So we're quite sure that Nebraska was warm enough at the time all these different animals were living here that it probably never got cold enough where the water froze or that it ever snowed. Many times we find tiny little fossil grass seeds in the mouths of the rhinoceroses or in the mouths of the horses. And these tiny little grass seeds are preserved in such detail that we're able to put those grass seeds under a microscope and determine what kinds of grasses were growing here in Nebraska. And that also provides us with very good evidence that Nebraska was a warm subtropical grassland at this time. Now, when all these different animals were living here in Nebraska, all living together here at one place at one time, a large volcano out in the Rocky Mountains exploded. And this volcano was a very large volcano, and it exploded with such force that it blasted tons and tons of fine powdery rock dust up into the atmosphere. When this volcano exploded and blasted all of this fine powdery rock dust up into the atmosphere, the winds were blowing in the right direction that huge clouds of this volcanic ash drifted in the sky toward Nebraska. And as these huge clouds of volcanic ash began to roll across the grasslands here in Nebraska, there was so much of this dust in the air that these animals began to breathe this dust in. And these animals were breathing in such a dense concentration of this dust that they began to suffocate and die. Once this storm of volcanic ash began to blow across the grasslands in Nebraska, we find that the smallest animals, like the birds and the turtles, were the first to die. They had the smallest lung capacity. They could not breathe in very much of this volcanic ash, and it wasn't long before they collapsed and died and fell to the ground. After they collapsed and fell to the ground, more volcanic ash blew across their bodies and accumulated on top of their bodies. Then the medium-sized animals, like the camels and the horses, had finally breathed in enough of this volcanic ash that they collapsed and died. They fell to the ground. More volcanic ash drifted across their carcasses and accumulated on top of their carcasses. Then finally, the big barrel-chested rhinoceroses collapsed and died. They had breathed in enough of this volcanic ash that they became weakened and died, and they fell to the ground. And sometimes the rhinoceroses collapsed and died right on top of the horses. When we get down to the rhino barn, we'll be able to show you a very good example of some of the rhino carcasses laying directly on top of the horse carcasses. Now, even after the big rhinos had collapsed and died, more volcanic ash continued to blow across their bodies and accumulate on top of their bodies. Another 5 to 6 foot of pure volcanic ash accumulated on top of the carcasses of the rhinos before the ash storm finally quit drifting and blowing across this ancient water hole that covered this area at this time. So the carcasses of these rhinoceroses and other animals were all buried deep enough under this blanket of volcanic ash that nothing really disturbed their skeletons for many, many years. It wasn't until 20 years ago, in 1971, that a paleontologist first discovered the first fossil washing out of the hillside here, the first fossil that was embedded in this bed of volcanic ash. and it has only been since 1971 that any excavation has taken place of the fossil skeletons in this bed of volcanic ash. The pulverized rock that is blasted out of a volcano is what we call volcanic ash. And volcanic ash is tiny little pieces of shattered glass, natural shattered glass. And when placed under a microscope, you can really see that volcanic ash is powdered glass. Very sharp, jagged edges like shattered plate glass. Now this volcanic ash can be chemically analyzed, and we have determined what the chemical content is in the volcanic ash. And since there is trace amounts of uranium in the volcanic ash, we can radiometrically date the volcanic ash. And that is where we have determined the 10 million year before present date on this ash bed and the volcanic ash from the trace amounts of uranium in the volcanic ash. Since we have determined what the chemical composition is of the volcanic ash, we can compare the chemical composition of rocks and try to determine where the volcano was that was the source of this volcanic ash. And the chemical composition of the ash matches up very close with the chemical composition of the rock that is in southwest Idaho, in an old volcanic caldera that is known as the Bruno Jar Bridge Eruptive Center in southwest Idaho. And so it is felt that this old extinct volcano in southwest Idaho was the source of the volcanic ash that caused this particular ash fall. Since we have an accumulation of 1.5 to 2 feet of it here in northeast Nebraska, it's felt that the volcanic eruption that caused this ash fall was quite possibly 200 times more powerful than the Mount St. Helens blasts, which occurred 11 years ago in Washington State. Quite an impressive fact in trying to imagine the extent of how large the volcanic eruption was and the large area that was impacted by this volcano. We have quite good evidence that some of the animals that died during the ash fall lingered and suffered for quite a while after the ash storm began. We have frothy, ropey coating that had developed on the bone that is symptomatic of severe lung disease. And this disease is called Marie's disease, or hypertrophic pulmonary osteodystrophy. And a pathologist that has examined these bones has determined that this frothy, ropey coating on the bone is this type of disease. And so we can see that some of the animals suffered quite severely from this disease before they finally died. And this display demonstrates that right here. Now, one of the unusual things that we've come across so far in trying to analyze this fossil deposit is that all of the animals I've been telling you about so far have been grass-eating animals: the rhinos, the horses, the camels. We have not found any fossil skeletons of any of the carnivores, but we have very good evidence that the carnivores were coming in and eating on the carcasses of these rhinos and horses, because we find that some of the skeletons have been scattered, some of the rhino and horse skeletons have been scattered. And in this particular case right here, we can see where one of the bone-crushing dogs came in and bit into the skull cap of this three-toed horse right here. This three-toed horse has puncture marks on its brain cap here from one of the bone-crushing dogs that was trying to pull its carcass out of the ash bed. But so far we have not found any direct fossil evidence of any of the bone-crushing dogs or the saber-toothed cats. And we're quite sure those animals were living here at the time, because we find their fossil evidence in the layers of rock immediately underneath the ash bed and in the layer of rock immediately above the ash bed as well.
They left the territory, huh? Or tried or something?
They may well have lived a little bit longer. Their lifestyle may have allowed them to live a little longer. The grass eaters would always have to have been sticking their muzzles down into the ground to try to pick up the grass to eat, whereas the meat-eating animals had their food right on the table. The carcasses of the horses and rhinos were laying right on the ground surface, and they could just go along and eat the meat off the surface. They may have been quite sick from breathing the ash, but they apparently did not breathe in as much of this ash as quickly as the grass-eating animals had done. It well could be that we may excavate a little further here and find some carcasses of the bone-crushing dogs, but as of this point we have not yet. When I was talking about the details that we have preserved in the volcanic ash here, right here you can see an example of the tiny little grass seeds that are preserved in the mouths of the rhinos. And these little grass seeds represent the last meal that these rhinoceroses ever ate. And they also give us a detailed picture as to the types of grasses that grew here in Nebraska at the time. And this bone right here is the tongue bone, the hyoid bone of one of the rhinos. And you have the little fossil grass seeds embedded right between the tongue bone there. In this display case, you're looking at the leg bones of the 5 different species of horses that lived here in northern Nebraska at the time the ashfall occurred. It's very unusual in the fossil record to find these delicate little side toes of the 3-toed horses preserved in the rock. But because these animals had been buried quite quickly by this volcanic ash, we still have the delicate little side toes of the 3-toed horses preserved in the volcanic ash. And here you can compare in size and character the 5 different species of prehistoric ashfall horses with a modern riding horse. This leg bone closest to you is the leg of a modern riding horse. This is the fossil skeleton of one of the crowned cranes I was talking about a little earlier here. And this particular crowned crane swallowed a lizard right before it died in the ash storm. There are some tiny pieces of bone underneath the rib bones of this crane, little tiny bones that do not belong to this skeleton. And close inspection showed that they were some lizard bones of a little lizard that was unlucky enough to have been eaten right before the ashfall occurred. Okay, why don't we follow the path here, and then we'll cut off the path a little further down. We just completed some of these walkways now, and we have some temporary labels up, but we hope to keep expanding on that just to help interpret this a little bit better. In 1971, a professional paleontologist who happened to grow up in the nearby town of Orchard was out walking around on this farm property looking for fossils. This farm place typically was a good place to find fossils because over the years pieces of fossil bone would erode out of the hillsides, and you could find them and then pick them up. This one day in 1971, when this professional paleontologist came to this park to look for fossils, he walked up the gully below me here, and he came to what was to be the first fossil ever found eroding out of this bed of volcanic ash. And he found that just right approximately where I'm standing here. Upon digging back into the bank, he found that not only was this a single jawbone of a baby rhinoceros, but he found that that jawbone was embedded in volcanic ash, and that's highly unusual. And he found that the entire skeleton of that baby rhino calf was buried back in that hillside. Further excavation showed that there were probably 5 or 6 more complete rhino skeletons buried back in this hillside. So at that time, this professional paleontologist wrote to the National Geographic Society, and the National Geographic Society provided the grant funding for a crew to come in and dig off the top part of this hill here and see how many fossil skeletons were buried under this hillside. In 1978 and 1979, the National Geographic dig took place here, and this area that is not much larger than the size of a basketball court, yielded over 200 complete fossil skeletons. At that time, there was no prospect for a state park to be built here, so all of the fossil skeletons were removed from the ground and they were taken to the University of Nebraska State Museum. Those skeletons are still in storage and still being researched at the University of Nebraska State Museum. As this area has been totally excavated of the volcanic ash and the skeletons, right now I am standing on what would be the bottom of the volcanic ash bed. And this bank behind me is some of the pure volcanic ash. The volcanic ash is a silvery gray material, and you can tell from scraping through it or even picking some of it up with your fingers, it is pure volcanic ash. And volcanic ash is powdery rock dust that's been blasted out of a volcano. And if you take a little bit of volcanic ash on your fingers and hold it up to the sun, the volcanic ash sparkles on your fingertips. And volcanic ash is powdered glass, pure powdered glass. If you can see the material sparkling on my fingertip, you can tell that this is powdered glass. Volcanic ash is pure powdered glass. This bank behind me is all volcanic ash, and you can tell at this point yet that we still had a depth of volcanic ash up at about my height right here. So there was at least 6 feet of pure volcanic ash deposited right here at this spot. Yeah, right there. If you tried to pick some of that up, this is okay. There you go.
It just, I mean, it just sparkles.
Glowed.
Yeah.
As the volcanic ash is exposed to the air, the volcanic ash begins to weather and turn into a different type of mineral, and you can see that that's a pretty highly weathered volcanic ash there. Right here, this is yeah, after you break through the crust, there's the pure stuff. The two assistants we have working in the rhino barn today are Ellen Steepleton. Ellen is a preparator at the University of Nebraska State Museum. She's one of our full-time staff persons. And over here we have Amy Gadert. Amy is a student at the University of Nebraska. A few minutes ago I showed you a sample of the volcanic ash, and I showed you that it was a silvery gray material, powdery silvery gray material. And if you look close here, all of the fossil skeletons in the rhino barn are laying in that silvery gray volcanic ash. When these animals died, they fell into the bed of volcanic ash. After they died, the volcanic ash continued to blow across their bodies and accumulate on the top of their bodies. Even after they had died, they were buried by a good 5 or 6 feet of pure volcanic ash. So their skeletons were totally covered by the same silvery gray material. Now all of the large skeletons you see in the center of the building here, these are the large full-grown rhinoceroses. The rhinos have a large blocky skull with large blocky cheek teeth here. This type of a rhino had short, stocky limb bones and long, heavy, curved rib bones, as you see right in front of me here. Same way with this individual right here. Well over 20 complete skeletons of camels have been found in this volcanic ash bed so far. And just a couple of weeks ago, we found the first skeleton in the rhino barn here. And this particular skeleton This particular camel is from a species that we had not found in the ash bed before. This is the third species of camel I had mentioned a little earlier here. This is one of the camels that was probably about the size of a llama. Probably looked somewhat similar to a llama.
Okay, this camel, if you can take a closer look at it, displays a very rough texture to its bone. You see there's white blotches of almost a cauliflower-like texture exhibited on the bones. And in fact, the rhinos show this too. This is a material, or this is a symptom that we refer to as Marie's disease. It indicates to us that the animals did die not instantly, but over a period of weeks as they went through slow respiratory failure. As their lungs began to fill with ash and lesions developed within their lungs, less and less oxygen was being supplied to their tissues. And the tissue which overlies the bone, called the periosteum, and even an adult animal is laying down new bone on a daily basis, was not getting enough oxygen, getting terribly inflamed and I'm sure painful. And as it ruptured it began to lay down bone very rapidly in an erratic fashion. We know that in modern animals that are in progressive lung disease, that it takes several weeks before this onset of this particular symptom occurs. And then once it does occur, mortality is fairly near. So we think that the rhinos probably died 4 to 6 weeks after the first, after the ash fall. Another thing that we see with this particular camel is that it was scavenged. It's not in its correct anatomical position. The smaller animals in the barn tend to show this more than the rhinos, that hindquarters have been pulled apart, limb bones have been broken open, and even we have some of the remains of carnivore scat. They're little bone chips in this fecal material, which has fossilized. Some of the bone-crushing dogs seem to be behaving as hyenas do today. Very commonly around a skeleton, we will find that they've marked the carcass with their scat, just as hyenas do today. Shall we move on? Let me see. What we have in the barn primarily, and in fact this has been the case throughout the site, the preponderance of animals are grazing animals, and these are the animals that we think just logically would have borne the brunt, the greatest exposure to the ash. These are animals that, just like grazing animals today, feed maybe 12 to 16 hours upon grass. However, their food source was now covered with ash, several feet of ash. So you can imagine these animals trying to paw through the ash and graze upon ash-covered grasses. So naturally they were just exposed to the ash to a very high degree. And we know that they, as I say, went into respiratory failure eventually and perished. What we're not sure about are the carnivores. We do, as I say, see their evidence that they were here. They had several opportunities, several days. There's sort of feeding levels exhibited throughout the barn where we can see that carcasses were being pulled apart. We find chew marks on the bones, and we find their fecal material. But we have not found a carnivore, one of the larger carnivores, preserved on the site. So there's several possibilities to account for that. One is that they just didn't suffer the same degree of exposure to the ash as these animals did. A large carnivore often needs to feed only once every 3 or 4 days. Certainly not hours and hours on end on a daily basis. So they may not have died at all. They may not have developed respiratory failure. Secondly, their instincts operate at a little different level than that of grazing animals. They may have had enough of a roaming, ranging tendency that they could have found areas that were less, had less ash, where there was less ash in the air, more sheltered and protected areas. Or thirdly, if they did succumb to respiratory failure eventually and to lung disease, as they grow weak and become diseased, again this was over a period of days, not an instant death, as an animal becomes weak, it naturally moves into the area where it feels most secure. We know that at least the bone-crushing dogs and the bear dogs were denning animals, burrowing, denning animals. So we expect that if they were becoming ill, that they retired to their den sites. And the den sites, of course, would not be in the low water hole, but in the highland areas nearby. So it will be a chance discovery of ash-filled burrow with a skeleton in it that will ever confirm that the animals died, that the carnivores died as a result of the ashfall itself. Okay, this is an area, it shows you the maximum degree of congestion. As you can see, it's hard for us to maneuver amongst all of these skeletons. One thing we found here is a newborn rhino calf. This one is probably about 2 months old, and its head is resting up, sort of nuzzling against this female rhino right here. So we don't obviously know for sure, but it's suggestive that perhaps this was a cow-calf pair. On the earlier dig, when a much larger area was exposed, they often found calves of this age actually in the nursing position, sort of nestled against the rib cage of females. We can tell a female rhino from an adult male rhino by this tusk here. Females have very short, small tusks, whereas males have these much larger, about 3 times the size, lower incisors, which are tusks. Again, from the earlier dig, we had the opportunity when excavating an adult like this one to prepare the interior, the abdominal cavities of these animals. We found lung tumors for one thing, but we also found fetuses. And the fetuses were inevitably in an animal with a short tusk. So we made the correlation that short tusks equal females. And we know that this is a newborn calf just by basis of tooth eruption. It only has 2 fully erupted and a 3rd tooth coming in each jaw. And again, from our sample of this population, we see that there's a progression, a step-like progression in tooth eruption and tooth wear. We know as a result that these animals calved simultaneously. Sometimes some animals will have their young scattered throughout the year, but these rhinos evidently gave birth within a period of a month each year. So the next age of calf we come across is one like this over here, an animal twice the size and with 5 to 6 teeth in each jaw, but still it's baby teeth. This has been the wonderful thing about this site. We're learning about their behavior, social behavior, as well as just anatomical features of the animals. We know that they had a very definite herd structure, that there were few males but many females and calves. We don't have many adolescent male rhinos in here, and again, that's consistent. Sort of as bison behave today, forming bachelor herds of the younger males. This seems to have been the behavior for these rhinos. Another animal, well actually representing a whole group of animals that we have on this site are the horses. And I'll try to point, I don't really want to, maybe I'll do a step here. Beginning here with the skull and then going around the corner sort of is fully displayed one of the larger horses, 3-toed horses found on this site. This would be the size of a pony. We have other species of horse which were much, much smaller. Most of the horses found on the site are primitive in the sense of having 3 toes. We do have one of the more modern horse, or the horse that eventually gave rise to the modern horse, Pliohippus, which is a single-toed horse. The beautifully preserved specimen of a horse down to the very last bone of the tail. For most of the animals in this barn and on this site, they've been known from the fossil record before Ashfall was discovered, but just from isolated bones, a skull here, a tooth there, a leg bone. These, including this horse, represent the first time that they've been found as completely articulated specimens, and that's very important. And furthermore, when you get a wide sample, whole populations of these, you begin to see the size variation, the sexual dimorphism, and then you become more secure in identifying this particular animal as a species different from the little horse over there, which is half the size. So we know that there were at least 5 distinct species of horse. Now today that's not the case. What is happening is that horses at a long time ago were occupying a whole lot of different ecological niches than they do today. Now they're pretty much restricted to the large grazing animal. In the past, they were occupying niches that may have resembled gazelles and deer a little bit more. But this is about the end of that. Artiodactyls, a whole different type of animal, are becoming more and more common and present, and horses are going to begin to wane and become fewer in number and species. So that's all I can think of to say right at the moment.
Is this actually the horse's hoof? In other words, this rhino fell on top of that horse's forefeet.
That's right. His leg is partially covered by the leg of this rhino. Yeah. Another neat thing is the fact that these animals are preserved in 3-dimension because of the ash. Usually, even if you do have a completely articulated skeleton in a fossil site, the overlying sediments have crushed the skeleton down so it's about flat as a pancake. Here the ash has enough strength that it resisted that compression to a great degree, and so it preserves these relationships really well. And you can see, yeah, it looks like this horse might have died or at least fallen before the horse or before the rhino did. And that's consistent throughout the site. We've never found a horse lying astride a rhino or a camel on top of a rhino. And that leads us to believe that the smaller animals died in advance of the larger animals. And one possibility for that, one reason why that might have been, is that they, simply being smaller, had more delicate respiratory systems. It didn't take as long for their lungs essentially to fill up with ash and become inoperable. So Amy is one of our really outstanding workers. This is her 2nd year on his site, and we were looking for people to work on the site who'd had previous digging experience, and in fact her previous digging experience was on archaeological sites, studying human remains and artifactual remains. She has a very careful digging technique, and also she's had a lot of experience in preparing zoology specimens. So perhaps, Amy, you'd like to tell us a little bit about your educational experience and what is drawing you into these fields like archaeology and paleontology.
Well, I'm a senior this year at the university. I got drawn into the anthropological aspect when I was a freshman in high school, and I was reading National Geographic and watching Discover Channel on TV and things like that. I'm just really interested in learning about the past, and there's so much to be learned still, and so that's why I went into that. I don't know.
Well, that's wonderful.
This bed of volcanic ash can be found across this area at the same stratigraphic level. You can find the same bed of volcanic ash across the valley, in the hill, and in the cliff at this same level. You can find this bed of volcanic ash in the road cuts and other cliffs further upstream. We always find this bed of volcanic ash at this elevation across this area here. On an average, this bed of volcanic ash is 1.5 to 2 foot thick in this area. On this hillside, the ash bed is 8 to 10 foot thick. This is the only hillside that we have found that the ash bed is 8 to 10 foot thick. This is the only hillside where we have found fossil skeletons in this bed of volcanic ash. It appears as though that this was a pond at the time these animals were living here. This was a low spot where after the animals collapsed and died here, the volcanic ash continued to drift in and accumulate on top of their bodies. The volcanic ash accumulated in this low spot, much as snow accumulates in a low spot during a blizzard. So that is why we have a greater depth of volcanic ash on this hillside than we do on an average across the area here. Okay. In this excavation, we are digging through the layers of sand that are located immediately underneath the bed of volcanic ash. In these layers of sand, we find bits and pieces of the prehistoric animals that lived and died sometime before the ashfall. Right off to my side here, you can see part of a rhino skull from the same species of rhino that we find in the rhino barn in the ash bed. And here is a wide flat bone that is the hip bone, the pelvis, of one of the elephants that lived at that time, one of the 4 Tusker elephants. And these are some of the larger pieces of bone from the larger animals we find in these layers of sand. We also find many tiny little pieces of bone from some of the smallest animals that lived at this time. Tiny little pieces of bone from the bats, from the lizards, from the snakes, from the mice that lived at this time. And they are such tiny fossils that we typically look for those fossils on these tables covered with window screen. After we scrape out the sand from this bedding, we lay the wet sand on top of the window screens, and as the sun dries the sand filters through the window screen. The sand filters through the window screen, and what is left on the screening tables are the tiny little pieces of bone from these different tiny prehistoric animals. So these screens are a means for us to find the tiniest of creatures that lived in Nebraska at this time. So far we have found fossil evidence of over 30 different species of animals from these layers of sand immediately underneath the ash bed. And at this point we have found fossil evidence of 16 different species of animals from the volcanic ash bed itself. So by doing this type of excavation, these layers of sand right underneath the ash bed, this helps to form a greater knowledge of the big picture of what the environment was like here in Nebraska at that time.
Show a rhino skull here, and we see full skeletons in here in the ash.
That's right.
You said this is below the ash. Are these, you find just partial skeletons below the ash layer? Is that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's correct. Well, when this particular rhino died, its bones laid in the ground surface for a while. The meat eaters tore the skeleton apart to a much greater extent than they were tore apart during the ash storm. Other rhinos came along and stomped on top of this rhino's bones. Elephant probably stepped on its bones. The bones become much more scattered and fragmented. That is because the bones are not buried quickly enough and deeply enough to give the nice detailed preservation such as we have in the fossil skeletons that are in the volcanic ash bed. Those animals were buried quickly enough and deeply enough after they died that we have the detailed preservation that you see in the rhino barn.
Great. This is great stuff.
Did the fossilization, did the ash actually cause that, even though it's after that, or?
Well, by saying fossilization, I would imagine you refer to the mineralization, the minerals percolating into the bone and replacing the natural elements of the bone. After a bone is buried by some form of sediment, groundwater will percolate through the ground and percolate through the bone, and the minerals in the water will percolate into the bone and stay in the bone and replace the natural minerals in the bone. And that's when the mineralization occurs. Here in the yellow sand we see a different type of mineralization than you see from the fossil specimens that are buried in the bed of volcanic ash. The bone has been buried in a different type of sediment, and therefore you have a different type of mineralization occur. Well, thank you for coming to the Ashfall Park and letting me share the story of this really spectacular fossil site with you. If you care to visit the Ashfall Park is open May through September. During the month of May before Memorial Day and in September after Labor Day, we are open 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Wednesday through Saturday and 1 to 4 p.m. on Sundays. We are closed Monday and Tuesday in May and September. From Memorial Day through Labor Day, through the summer months, we are open from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Saturday and 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. on Sundays. So if you ever get a chance to visit northeast Nebraska, you have to be sure to locate the Ashfall Fossil Bed State Historical Park, which is located near the towns of Royal and Orchard, Nebraska, in northeast Nebraska, and make this a part of your next visit to Nebraska.
All right, say, wasn't that fascinating? I tell you to think, right here in the good old US of A, we have 10 million year old creatures exactly as there is in Africa. 10 million years ago. And beloved, I'm going to tell you, if you're ever in Nebraska passing through, I don't care how far you have to go out of your way, it's a trip well spent. I think probably that as far as ancient remains, that you'll never anywhere in this earth find a better preserved group of animals, exactly as they fell, and then covered over with ash whereby the carnivores could not destroy the bodies. I noticed in one of the horses that even the little bones in the tail were exactly laid out in place, with a big rhino falling right across the horse, and a horse's hoof coming out under the rhino's neck. Hey, it is really awesome. And I kind of have the same spirit that I felt when I was in the petrified forest driving through. And you see the eruption and huge cedars, like cedars of Lebanon, coming out of those, sticking out of the piles of stone, buried 50, 60, 100 more feet. To know something real tragic happened on this earth at one time. We kind of know what it was, don't we? That upheaval when God sentenced Satan to death, called the Kabel, the overthrow. But again, I cannot emphasize enough, you're going to find the people at this state park very friendly and very helpful, and you'll be able to see the actual fall of the ash from the volcano, and that ash itself is just glass. It's amazing to know what has happened in time past gone by. I just want to say a quick word. We've always heard that by certain scholars that the Earth's crust at one time was all together. In other words, if you put Africa and the United States of America together, they basically, like the puzzle, like you were putting together a picture puzzle, they fit, all right? And many scholars believe they were at one time together, and then they spread apart. But this is probably one of the most impressive finds that said to me, quite frankly, I'll have to plead ignorance. I didn't even know that rhinoceroses ever habited the Americas. But hey, I know better now, because there they were. And even in the palate of the mouth, seed from the very grass that was growing at that time, to see what was growing in this great country at that time. No, don't miss Nebraska. Don't miss this site. I think that of all times and all things and all that could have ever been written by scholars concerning the plates of this earth, the incrustation, and the movement of those plates. And just recently we saw the plate in California near Joshua's tree, that plate moved 5 feet. Now think about it. The earth moved 5 feet. That plate did. So if a plate can move 5 feet naturally, the whole city of Los Angeles moved either some part of an inch, like 1 inch, not quite maybe, but the whole city. Think about the magnitude of weight and the awesome power of nature itself when it unleashes the energy built up by the slippage of those plates. Yeah, it was a little sad in a way, loving animals, and you could see that, no doubt, that these animals all came to this water hole in the last throes of life, that the dust was falling, and they were suffocating, as we could find lung disease in many of those animals. And we could see 10 million years ago that those animals all fled to this place of refuge. And unfortunately, as so often happens, that place that maybe would cool the fever a little bit, maybe a little bit of moisture, but that ash that fell, and we, and even this generation, know about Mount St. Helens, don't we? And poor old Truman, that was a resident very near, we know that he's probably under about 100 feet of ash at this time. How terrible and awesome God's nature can be. I didn't say God did it, but I said His nature can be. When you speak of the slippage and the friction from plates and the passage of time. But here we see all these animals, and it isn't like someone guessed that this happened in this way. Beloved, there it is, absolute proof of the first earth age, spoken of by Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3. If I were to title the place, I would probably give it a name. I know it's called the Ashfall, but I think I would call it As They Fell, because that's how you find them, exactly as they fell, all in position, all struggling for life. And I would have to say one thing, and perhaps many will see this documentary that would disagree, that do not accept God's word as the word. But when you look at the sadness of these creatures gasping for that last breath of clean air and this silicon glass cutting into the lung as they had to breathe it, then we know Satan caused this also. Satan, is it no wonder that God named him the destroyer? For that's what it has been since the start of his fall, destruction after destruction, pain after pain. So think about it. As you see these creatures, that overthrow, that chaotic period, and that chaos, that particular one was brought forward by God to even change the position of the earth. Could it be that as we saw zebras with 5 different types of horses, and believe me, the hooves are there, you can see them as you saw in the documentary, and those animals that were not thought to have existed in the Americas, there they were. And let it be another spot of learning, another point in our education on this quest for truth, in this quest for answers. I think we've had a great deal added to our knowledge concerning that first earth age spoken of again by Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3. I cannot express to you the awesome feeling of seeing not a bone scattered here and a bone scattered there, but complete animals
in that fight for survival, being drawn to this place that gives you better documentation of the first Earth age. That first Earth age, that Satan was also the spoiler. So as you travel the byways, and in this case you'll have back road a little bit, but they're good all-weather roads, you'll enjoy it. For just a short mile or two, don't let me mislead you. Easy to find. That if you're through, take a moment out of your life and visit Ashfall. See for yourself, and let the spirit of 10 million years ago settle in your mind. So there you have it, Ashfall, and beloved, you were there.